Hi, welcome back to the First Draft Club. Today we are talking about Ann Patchett. You probably know who Ann Patchett is. If you don't, now you do. You're going to. Ann is the owner of Parnassus Books, a wonderful bookstore in Nashville where I used to live. And she is an international best-selling author. Among the numerous books she has written and published is the novel Bel Canto. Bel Canto is probably her most well-known novel, I would venture to say. After it came out in 2001, it won the Penn Faulkner Award and the Orange Prize. It got a lot of accolades. It's been made into a movie. But the reason I'm talking now in this episode today about a novel that came out 25 years ago is that there's a brand new edition of the book that just came out. And I recently read it after stumbling on it on this new edition in an airport. It's this bright blue hardback copy, and it was annotated by Ann, and not by Ann 25 years ago, by Ann now. It is filled with her scribbles in the margins in her own handwriting, which is just fun. And so I absolutely loved reading this new edition. I haven't read the novel in well over 20 years. And so I remembered reading it, but it's been a while. And so reading this new edition, I found myself realizing something and coming up with a kind of a set of kind of takeaways for both novelists and memoirists. And I want to share those takeaways in this episode. So that is what we are going to be talking about today. Welcome to the First Draft Club, a podcast to help you write your book with joy, clarity, and maybe a few coffee stains. I'm Mary Atkins. All right, so let's talk about Bel Canto. The novel opens at a fancy birthday party at the vice president's mansion in an unnamed South American country. The party is attended by dignitaries and other high-profile guests, and the entertainment for the evening is a famous American opera singer, fictional opera singer named Roxanne Koss. While Roxanne is performing, a guerrilla group storms the mansion and takes everyone hostage. And the novel then tracks this hostage crisis inside the home, which lasts about 4 months. It's long. We are with the hostages and the terrorists through this entire ordeal. We are confined to the house, just like they are. It sounds like a thriller, but it actually, and this is, I think, one amazing kind of beautiful, surprising quality of this book, is that it's actually not. It becomes more of this kind of dreamlike meditation on art and human connection in surprising places. I'm not giving away any spoilers when I tell you that she creates this kind of suspended world where the captors and the hostages form meaningful relationships, which makes the ending devastating in a way that at least I didn't see coming either time I read this book. So it's this kind of sort of quiet claustrophobia and fear that she creates that give way to these unexpectedly tender moments. And it really, in that way, actually kind of reminded me of the pandemic. The loneliness of it, the isolation, the sequestering, and how these kind of precious, surprising, tender moments could emerge from that. Anyway, when I read it post 2020, that was something I took away, and that was kind of interesting. But pandemic aside, literary interpretation aside, it was fascinating to see Ann's reflections on her novel more than 25 years after she wrote it. And more specifically, and the reason I'm making a whole podcast episode about this edition of the book is that I want to talk about her annotations. So let's do that. I put her annotations into 3 categories, okay? First, she tells little stories about the origin of certain characters or moments. These peter off a little bit as you kind of move through the book, but she especially does this near the beginning as she's introducing people. Second, she comments on what she's observing in the craft, like what the writing is doing in particular moments, how it's working, how the writing feels, what it's doing to her as the reader. Almost like these in this category of annotations is the category that she could have done on anyone else's writing. Like it didn't need to be hers. These were my favorite annotations, these kind of craft observations. And then third, she calls out stuff she doesn't like. She calls out stuff that her old self did that she would not do today. So this includes, she puts brackets around words and phrases that she would cut, and she makes margin notes in particular about parts that she finds kind of repetitive or wordy. Now, interestingly, almost every time she points out kind of repeat word or some idea that she thinks she's conveyed multiple times unnecessarily, I found that I had not noticed as a reader. Had her annotation not been there pointing it out, I would have had no idea. This was fascinating. And my neighbor, Pam, who also reread this edition this spring, said the same thing. She said that she was so immersed in the story that she never would have noticed, like the same word appearing 3 times in one paragraph if Anne hadn't pointed it out in her annotations. And, clearly Anne's editors at the time were in the same boat because they didn't catch it either, or at least didn't feel like it was worth flagging if they did catch it. But this third category of annotations is really where the lesson is here. And so I want to dig deeper into it. To do so, I need to step away from Bel Canto for a moment and talk about myself. I published a memoir earlier this year about my 3 miscarriages over 9 months and my secondary infertility, which is what it's called when you've had a child but you can't have another one. And a couple of years ago, when I was circulating early drafts of this memoir to early readers, I had this one passage where I thought I was being cute. In the passage, I was discussing a moment when my husband and I had a consultation, like a kind of entry point consultation at an IVF clinic, an initial consultation. That's the word I'm looking for. And it's a serious scene. Like it's actually a pretty heavy scene. In this clinic appointment, I learned that my odds of IVF working for me at 40 when I haven't frozen my eggs prior are very bad. They're not good odds. And so in the draft, I had just learned this, and I wrote a paragraph about my reflecting as I was leaving the clinic, like the thoughts that were on my mind. And I had written something like, what had I been doing all of those years of my 30s when I should have been freezing my eggs? Going to bars and getting drunk with my friends. I had written something like that. I thought I was being kind of cute, kind of charming and self-deprecating. Does it have some bitterness to it? Sure, but I was feeling bitter at the time, So to me, honestly, it reflected pretty accurately the thought I was having at the time. But feedback from early readers was that it was mean, that it came across as if writer Mary was being insensitive to former Mary, to Mary who was 35 and going to bars with her friends and having drinks. Like it came across as cruel and unfair. It came across as unfair. Multiple readers who were also friends were defensive of me. I remember them saying things like, yeah, Mary, this part really bothered me. Like, you're not being fair to your old self. You were doing real things that mattered. Like you were living your life. You were enjoying your life. You were writing your novels. And of course they were right. It wasn't as if I now, as my current self writing the memoir, thought that voice in my head at the time was wise or correct. I didn't still think, oh yeah, my 30s were totally wasted. But the decision to give this little voice space on the page was being viewed as an act of kind of legitimizing it that was reading as insensitive and unfair. So to circle back to the annotated Bel Canto, when current Ann was critical of past Ann, I was surprised to find that, like my friends reading my memoir, my attitude was to feel protective and like kind of defensive of her younger writer self, which was really interesting. I would think things like, be gentle with her. Like, she did a really good job. I actually don't mind this. I think this is fine, And this is really interesting to me. And this is where we get to what I think is the takeaway for, we'll start with memoirists and then we'll get to novelists in a moment. Here we have a takeaway for memoirists from a craft perspective. Yes, you want an emotional arc. You want to show the reader how you have changed. That is what a memoir is. But be wary of skewering your former self, or even just being too critical in a way that you may think is cute, but that isn't coming across the way that you want it to. It's coming across as severe or unfair. You want to strike a balance between honesty and humility on one hand, and compassion for your former self on the other. We don't want the reader to have to assume the position of the wiser older sibling or therapist going, hey, like let's honor our past self who was doing the best she could, okay? Like, we don't want the reader to have to fill that role for us. Now, what does this have to teach all of us, not just memoirists, but fiction writers, novelists too, about overall mindset, not just from a craft perspective, but as people who make art? I think it's this. The hope is that we are always getting better at our craft, right? That is the hope. Ideally, our subsequent books are always better than our previous books, because otherwise we're not improving. And if we're going to be constantly improving, then it means our old stuff is going to be stuff that we would make differently now if given the chance. That's just the reality, but it doesn't have to be a regret. So say it with me: reality, not regret. This is the mantra of today's episode. Of course, I would write my books differently now. I'm older, I've lived more, I've refined certain skills. I wouldn't write all of them differently, but there are parts that I would. That doesn't mean those stories are anything other than precisely what they should be. They are creations with a timestamp. The timestamp is who I was, what my world was like, and what skill set I possessed at the time. There's nothing wrong about our work being time-stamped by our limitations. I'll say that one more time because that feels important. There's nothing wrong about our work being time-stamped by our limitations. That's all for today. Thanks for listening. I hope this was helpful, and I will see you next episode.